Laura Sanders had spent the past year transforming her new home into her sanctuary. A successful landscape designer, she poured her energy and creativity into crafting an outdoor oasis that would reflect her vision of beauty and peace. The centerpiece of her project was a sleek hot tub surrounded by vibrant greenery and ambient lighting, a personal retreat where she could unwind after long days. For Laura, the hot tub was more than just a luxury, it symbolized her hard work and independence. It was hers, a culmination of everything she had built for herself. The first few weeks of enjoying her completed space were blissful. She would sit under the stars, steam rising from the water, and feel a deep sense of satisfaction. This was her home, her dream, finally realized. But that peace was shattered one morning when she stepped outside to water her plants. Her eyes immediately caught sight of a large, official-looking notice affixed to her gate. The bold black lettering read "Violation of Community Rules, Unauthorized Installation of Structure." Beneath it, the message stated that her hot tub had to be removed within 14 days, or she would face escalating fines and further action. Laura stared at the notice in disbelief. It had to be some kind of mistake. Her property wasn't part of any homeowners association. She had made sure of that when she bought the house. The previous owner had been very clear about the lack of restrictions or obligations tied to the property, which was one of the reasons she had purchased it. Shaking her head, she pulled the notice down and walked back inside, thinking it would be an easy issue to resolve. A simple phone call to clarify the misunderstanding would surely take care of it. That afternoon, Laura dialed the number listed on the notice. After several rings, a woman with a clipped tone answered, introducing herself as a representative of the local neighborhood committee. Laura explained the situation, calmly stating that her property wasn't under any such jurisdiction and that the notice must have been posted in error. The woman on the other end of the line was curt and dismissive. "All properties in the area are required to comply with community guidelines," she said. "Your address is included in the latest boundary update. You should have received the revised regulations." "I didn't receive anything," Laura replied firmly, her patience wearing thin. "And I wasn't informed of any changes when I bought this house. My property isn't under your jurisdiction." "That's something you'll need to take up with our compliance team," the woman replied coldly. "In the meantime, the notice stands. Failure to comply will result in penalties." Before Laura could protest further, the line went dead. Confused and frustrated, Laura dug through her files, looking for any documentation from her home purchase that might clarify the situation. There was nothing, no mention of any homeowners association or community rules. Determined to get to the bottom of it, she decided to visit the local office of the committee in person the next day. The office was housed in an unassuming building in the center of town. Laura walked in, greeted by the faint hum of a copier and the sterile smell of paper and ink. A receptionist glanced up from her desk and gave Laura a tight-lipped smile. "Can I help you?" she asked in a tone that suggested she'd rather be doing anything else. "Yes," Laura said, holding up the notice. "I received this yesterday, but it's a mistake. My property isn't part of any neighborhood association. I need to speak to someone about this." The receptionist's expression didn't change. She asked for Laura's address, typed it into her computer, and frowned. "According to our system, your property was annexed into the association's jurisdiction earlier this year. You should have been notified." "I wasn't," Laura said firmly. "And I don't agree to this. I didn't sign anything. How can you annex a property without the owner's consent?" The receptionist shrugged. "That's something you'll need to discuss with our compliance officer. Unfortunately, they're not available right now. I can schedule a meeting for you next week." Laura clenched her jaw, her frustration growing. "Next week isn't good enough. I need this resolved now." The receptionist's smile turned brittle. "That's the earliest availability. If you'd like, I can leave a message." Realizing she was getting nowhere, Laura left the office, the notice still in her hand. As she walked back to her car, a creeping sense of unease settled over her. Something about this felt wrong. If her property had truly been annexed into this so-called association, why hadn't she been informed? And why was the enforcement so sudden and aggressive? That evening, Laura sat on her patio, staring at the hot tub that had brought her so much joy just days ago. Now it felt tainted, a source of stress rather than relaxation. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a bureaucratic mix-up. The dismissive attitude of the woman on the phone and the receptionist's vague responses only added to her suspicions. She decided then and there that she wouldn't let this slide. Her home was hers, and she wasn't going to give up her hard-earned peace without a fight. But Laura had no idea just how far-reaching the consequences of her stand would be, or how much she would have to sacrifice to protect what was hers. The next morning, Laura woke up determined to dig deeper into the strange notice she had received. She had spent the previous night combing through every piece of paperwork from when she bought the house, but there was nothing that even hinted at her property being part of any association or neighborhood group. She had chosen this house specifically because it didn't come with any restrictions, so the idea that she could suddenly be forced into compliance felt absurd. Armed with her documents and her growing frustration, Laura decided to confront the situation head-on. Her first stop was the county records office. If there had been any recent changes to her property's status, surely there would be a record of it here. The building was bustling with people, most of them handling mundane matters like vehicle registration or property taxes. Laura approached the counter and explained her situation to a clerk, a middle-aged man with a tired but patient demeanor. He asked for her address and began typing into his computer. After a few moments, he frowned. "It looks like there was a boundary adjustment filed earlier this year," he said, squinting at the screen. "Your property was added to the neighborhood association's jurisdiction as part of that adjustment." "What adjustment?" Laura demanded, her voice sharper than she intended. "I wasn't notified about any of this. Isn't the owner supposed to be informed?" The clerk shrugged, clearly uninterested in getting involved. "That's not something we handle. You'd have to take it up with the association or whoever filed the adjustment." "Who filed it?" Laura asked, her frustration mounting. The clerk clicked around on his computer before reading off a name Laura didn't recognize. It was listed as the president of the neighborhood group, the same organization that had issued the notice about her hot tub. Her stomach tightened. She thanked the clerk and left the office, her mind racing. If someone had arbitrarily decided to include her property in their jurisdiction, she needed to know why and how they thought they could get away with it. Determined to get answers, Laura called the number she'd been given at the neighborhood committee office the day before. This time she asked directly to speak with the president. After being put on hold for what felt like an eternity, a woman's voice finally came on the line. "This is Marjorie Crane," the voice said, calm and measured. "How can I help you?" Laura took a deep breath, trying to keep her frustration in check. "This is Laura Sanders. I own the property at 322 West Briar Lane. I received a notice yesterday saying my hot tub violates your community rules, but my property isn't part of any association. I'd like to know what's going on." There was a brief pause before Marjorie replied, her tone dripping with condescension. "Ah, yes, Miss Sanders. Your property was recently annexed into our jurisdiction. We've been updating our records and enforcing compliance with our guidelines." "Annex," Laura repeated, incredulous. "How can you annex a property without the owner's consent?" "I didn't sign anything. I wasn't even notified." Marjorie's voice remained irritatingly calm. "The boundary adjustment was approved by the necessary authorities. Notification was sent out to all affected properties." "Well, I didn't receive anything," Laura shot back, "and I don't agree to this. My property is private, and I don't see how you have the right to impose your rules on me." "Our rules exist to maintain the integrity and appearance of the neighborhood," Marjorie said smoothly, as if reading from a script. "I'm afraid compliance is mandatory for all properties within our boundaries. If you have any further concerns, I suggest you consult your legal counsel." Before Laura could respond, the line went dead. She stared at her phone in disbelief. The audacity of this woman was infuriating. Marjorie had made it sound as though Laura's objections didn't matter in the slightest, as though her property was nothing more than a piece on a chessboard for the association to move as they pleased. Frustrated and out of options for the moment, Laura decided to return home and think through her next steps. When she pulled into her driveway, she was met with a sight that made her blood boil. A large, heavy-duty chain had been wrapped around her hot tub, securing the lid in place. Attached to the chain was a padlock, and dangling from the lock was another notice: unauthorized use of community property. Access restricted until compliance is verified. Laura stormed into her house, shaking with anger. This was beyond ridiculous. How could they just come onto her property and do something like this? It felt like an invasion, a blatant overreach of power. She grabbed her phone and began taking pictures of the chain and the notice, documenting everything. This wasn't just about the hot tub anymore, this was about her rights as a property owner. That evening, Laura received a knock at her door. She opened it to find her neighbor James standing there, a worried expression on his face. James was an older man who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. He had always been friendly in passing, and Laura appreciated his calm demeanor. "I heard about what's going on," James said, his voice low. "I thought you might want to know you're not the first person they've done this to." Laura invited him inside, and they sat at her kitchen table while James explained. Over the past few months, several other properties in the neighborhood had been annexed into the association's jurisdiction under similar circumstances. In each case, the owners had received little to no warning before being hit with notices, fines, and restrictions. James himself had been targeted when the association claimed part of his garage encroached on community land. "They've been pushing people to either comply or sell," James said grimly, "and those who sell usually end up losing money on the deal. It's like they're trying to drive people out." Laura listened intently, her anger simmering beneath the surface. This wasn't just about her hot tub, it was part of a larger pattern of intimidation and control. She thanked James for the information and promised to keep him updated on her situation. That night, as Laura sat in her living room, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The chain on her hot tub, the dismissive attitude of Marjorie Crane, the stories from James, all of it pointed to something much bigger. She didn't know exactly what was going on, but she was determined to find out, and she wasn't going to let anyone take what was hers without a fight. Laura awoke the next morning with a renewed sense of determination. The chain around her hot tub and the dismissive attitude of Marjorie Crane had ignited a fire within her. This wasn't just about the hot tub anymore, it was about standing up to what felt like an orchestrated campaign to strip her of her rights. She wasn't going to sit back and let them win. Her first move was to contact her lawyer, a sharp and no-nonsense woman named Ellen Ward, whom Laura had worked with during the purchase of her home. Ellen listened intently as Laura recounted everything: the notice, the chain, the phone call with Marjorie, and her visit to the county office. When Laura finished, Ellen didn't mince words. "This is serious," Ellen said. "If what you're telling me is accurate, this so-called boundary adjustment could be a major violation of property law. No one can just annex your property without proper documentation and your explicit consent. I'll start digging into the records and see what I can find. In the meantime, document everything: every notice, every interaction, every time they step foot on your property. We'll need all the evidence we can get." Feeling a sense of relief that she had someone on her side, Laura spent the rest of the day photographing her property and organizing the documents she already had. But as the day went on, her sense of unease grew. Several times, she noticed a dark sedan parked at the end of her street, its tinted windows reflecting the sunlight. It didn't seem to belong to any of her neighbors, and each time she went outside, the car would start up and drive away. That evening, Laura received an email from Ellen. Attached was a scanned copy of the boundary adjustment document that had been filed with the county. The document was signed by a handful of individuals listed as community representatives. But Laura's name or any indication that she had been notified was conspicuously absent. Ellen's message was brief but clear: "This document is highly suspect. We'll need to challenge its validity, but be prepared for pushback." Laura's frustration boiled over. How could this have happened? She had followed every rule, done everything right when she bought the house. Now she was being dragged into a bureaucratic nightmare with no end in sight. The next morning, Laura decided to take matters into her own hands. She knocked on the doors of several of her neighbors, hoping to find someone else who had been affected by the boundary adjustment. Most of them were polite but hesitant to talk, claiming they hadn't experienced any issues. But one neighbor, a young mother named Rachel, invited Laura inside and shared her own story. "They came after us last year," Rachel said, her voice low as she glanced nervously at the window. It started with small fines, trash bins left out too long, grass a little too high. Then they claimed the swing set in our backyard was a safety violation. We fought back at first, but it just got worse. My husband wanted to sell and move on, so we did. We lost so much money on the house. But we couldn't deal with the stress anymore. Laura felt a chill run down her spine. Rachel's story confirmed what James had told her. This was a calculated effort to pressure homeowners into submission or force them out entirely. But unlike Rachel, Laura wasn't ready to give up. That afternoon, Laura returned home to find a new notice taped to her front door. This one was even more aggressive, threatening daily fines of $500 if the chain around her hot tub was removed. It also included a line that made her blood boil. Failure to comply may result in the suspension of access to your property until compliance is achieved. Laura immediately called Ellen and forwarded her a photo of the notice. Ellen's response was swift. "This is intimidation, plain and simple. They're overstepping their authority, and they know it. I'm filing a formal complaint with the county and requesting an injunction to stop them from enforcing these so-called rules. But be careful. Laura, they're trying to push you into a corner. Don't give them any excuse to escalate further." Despite Ellen's reassurance, Laura couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. That night, as she sat in her living room, she noticed movement outside her window. Peering through the blinds, she saw two men standing near the edge of her property, pointing at the hot tub and speaking in hushed tones. Before she could confront them, they disappeared into the shadows. The next morning, Laura discovered something that made her stomach drop. The garden beds surrounding her hot tub had been trampled, and several of the lights she had installed had been smashed. She immediately checked the footage from the cameras she had set up the day before, but whoever had done it had managed to avoid being caught on video. Feeling a mix of anger and helplessness, Laura called the police to report the vandalism. An officer arrived an hour later, but his response left her frustrated. "It's hard to prove anything without witnesses or clear footage," he said with a shrug. "Could be kids messing around, or maybe someone's just unhappy with you. I'll file a report, but there's not much else we can do." As the officer left, Laura's phone buzzed with a new message from Ellen. "The injunction has been filed," it read. "This should buy us some time to figure out our next move. Stay vigilant." But staying vigilant was easier said than done. Over the next few days, Laura found herself constantly on edge. The dark sedan continued to appear at odd hours, and she received several anonymous phone calls where the caller would hang up as soon as she answered. Then, one evening, she heard the unmistakable sound of a drone buzzing overhead. Rushing outside, she saw the small device hovering over her backyard, its camera lens trained on her hot tub. Laura grabbed a broom and swung at the drone, but it darted out of reach and disappeared over the fence. She stood there, her heart pounding, as the realization sank in whoever was behind this wasn't going to back off easily. That night, Laura made a decision. She wasn't just going to defend her home, she was going to fight back. She started by contacting a private investigator recommended by Ellen. If someone was watching her, she needed to know who they were and why. As she waited for the investigator to get back to her, Laura spent hours researching the names on the boundary adjustment document. One of them stood out, a man named Richard Bowen, who was listed as the head of the committee responsible for the adjustment. A quick online search revealed that Richard had close ties to a local development firm that specialized in turning residential neighborhoods into high-end commercial spaces. Laura's suspicions deepened. This wasn't just about community rules or property lines. It was about money, and her property was right in the middle of whatever scheme they were running. As the days passed, Laura braced herself for whatever was coming next. She didn't know who she could trust or how far her opponents were willing to go, but one thing was certain: she wasn't going to let them take her home without a fight. The days that followed were a blur of tension and uncertainty for Laura. The vandalism, the surveillance, and the escalating notices had created a constant sense of unease. Every time she walked outside, she felt as though eyes were on her, watching her every move. The private investigator, Marcus Kane, had begun his work, but results would take time. In the meantime, Laura's lawyer, Ellen, filed another set of documents with the county, questioning the legality of the annexation and demanding an investigation into the committee's practices. While that legal battle moved forward, Laura focused on protecting herself and her property. The first thing she did was upgrade her security system. The cameras she had initially installed to monitor her hot tub were replaced with high-definition models that covered the entire perimeter of her property. Motion-activated floodlights were mounted on the corners of her house, and she began keeping a detailed log of every strange occurrence, from the dark sedan's appearances to the late-night buzzing of drones. Marcus had advised her to treat every incident as part of a broader pattern. Even if something seems small or insignificant, he told her, write it down. Patterns can tell us a lot about who's behind this. Despite her efforts, the pressure continued to mount. One morning, Laura woke up to find another notice taped to her door. This one was more aggressive than the last, stating that failure to comply with the community's regulations would result in further action, including the potential seizure of property for non-compliance. The language was vague but threatening, and Laura felt her stomach twist as she read the words. She immediately forwarded the notice to Ellen, who called her within minutes. "This is a scare tactic," Ellen said firmly. "They're trying to intimidate you into giving up. Don't let them get to you. I've already reached out to the county to demand a review of their authority to issue these kinds of threats. They're overstepping, and they know it." Laura appreciated Ellen's confidence, but it was hard not to feel the weight of the situation. The committee's tactics were invasive and relentless, and she couldn't help but wonder what their endgame was. It was clear they wanted her to either comply or leave, but why? Why her property, and why now? The first breakthrough came later that week when Marcus called with an update. "I've been looking into the names you gave me from that boundary adjustment document," he said. One of them, Richard Bowen, is connected to a development firm called Horizon Partners. They specialize in flipping residential neighborhoods into commercial zones, shopping centers, office parks, that sort of thing. Laura's pulse quickened. "So they're trying to buy up properties for development." "Looks that way," Marcus replied. "Your property and a few others are in a prime location for what they're planning. But here's where it gets interesting. I found some financial records that link Bowen and Horizon Partners to Marjorie Crane. She's been getting payments from them for consulting services. It's not illegal on the surface, but it raises a lot of questions." Laura felt a surge of anger. So this wasn't about community rules or aesthetics, it was about profit. Her property wasn't just a home, it was a valuable piece of real estate that these people wanted to control. And Marjorie Crane, with her smug condescension and veiled threats, was at the center of it all. Armed with this new information, Laura met with Ellen to discuss their next steps. "This changes everything," Ellen said after reviewing Marcus's findings. "If we can prove that Marjorie and the committee are acting in bad faith using their position to enrich themselves, we can take this to court. But we'll need more evidence. Payments alone might not be enough to show intent." Over the next few days, Marcus continued digging while Laura focused on rallying support from her neighbors. Many of them were reluctant to speak out, either out of fear or apathy, but a few began to open up. James, her elderly neighbor, shared more details about how the committee had pressured him into giving up part of his garage. Another neighbor, a single mother named Alina, revealed that she had been fined repeatedly for minor violations like leaving toys in her yard or hanging laundry outside. Both of them expressed frustration and helplessness but seemed hesitant to take action. "They've got everyone scared," James said during one of their conversations. "Nobody wants to fight back because they think it's a losing battle. They're afraid of losing their homes." Laura understood their fear, but she couldn't let it stop her. She encouraged James and Elena to document their experiences and offered to connect them with Ellen if they wanted to pursue legal action. "The more of us who stand up to them, the harder it will be for them to keep getting away with this," she said. As Laura worked to build a case against the committee, the harassment continued. One night, she was startled awake by the sound of her motion-activated lights flooding the backyard. She ran to the window and saw two figures standing near the hot tub, their faces obscured by hooded sweatshirts. Before she could do anything, they sprinted into the darkness, disappearing through the trees. The next morning, she discovered that one of her cameras had been smashed and the chain around her hot tub had been cut. It felt like a message they weren't backing down, and they weren't afraid to escalate. Laura reported the incident to the police, but their response was predictably lackluster. "We'll keep an eye on the area," the officer said, his tone making it clear that he didn't consider the matter a priority. Frustrated but undeterred, Laura replaced the broken camera and reinforced her security measures. Meanwhile, Marcus uncovered another crucial piece of information. "I found a series of emails between Marjorie and a few other committee members," he told Laura during their next call. "They're talking about streamlining compliance and maximizing the value of the neighborhood. There's also a mention of Horizon Partners providing logistical support. It's pretty clear they're coordinating with the developers to force people out." Laura's hands clenched into fists as she listened. "So they're basically running people off their land to make way for this development." "Exactly," Marcus confirmed. "But here's the kicker, there's a timeline. They're pushing hard to get everything wrapped up within the next 6 months. I think Horizon Partners has investors breathing down their necks." The revelation lit a fire under Laura. The committee wasn't just acting unethically, they were operating on borrowed time, which meant their tactics would only get more aggressive as the deadline approached. She shared the new information with Ellen, who immediately began drafting a formal complaint to the county and state attorney general's office. "If we can prove collusion between the committee and Horizon Partners, we might be able to shut this down before it goes any further," Ellen said. But Laura knew that even with legal action underway, the fight was far from over. The committee had already shown they were willing to resort to underhanded tactics, and she had no doubt they would continue to target her and anyone else who stood in their way. As she sat in her living room that evening, reviewing the mountain of evidence she and Marcus had gathered, she felt a mix of anger and determination. This wasn't just about saving her hot tub or her property, it was about standing up to people who thought they could steamroll over others for their own gain. The next morning, Laura woke up to find another notice taped to her door. This one was different from the others. Instead of fines or threats of compliance, it simply read, "This isn't over. You should know when to quit." Laura's resolve hardened. They could try to scare her, but she wasn't going anywhere. Laura's resolve to fight back only hardened after finding the ominous note taped to her door. It was a blatant threat, and while it unsettled her, it also reaffirmed what she had come to understand: this wasn't just about rules or compliance. The committee, Marjorie Crane, and Horizon Partners were all in on a coordinated effort to seize control of her property, and they were willing to go to extreme lengths to get what they wanted. But Laura wasn't about to let them scare her into submission. The day began with yet another unwelcome escalation. As Laura stepped out to water her plants, she noticed a group of workers in high-visibility vests standing at the edge of her property, near the fence that bordered her backyard. They were unloading tools and machinery from a van, and one of them appeared to be setting up a tripod-mounted laser level. Laura approached them, her voice firm. "What are you doing on my property?" A man who appeared to be the supervisor turned to her, clipboard in hand. "We're conducting a survey," he said flatly. "It's standard procedure for any boundary adjustments in the neighborhood." "You don't have permission to be here," Laura shot back. "This is private property, and you're trespassing." The man raised an eyebrow, clearly unfazed. "We're authorized by the committee. If you have an issue, you'll need to take it up with them." Fuming, Laura took out her phone and began filming. "Leave now or I'm calling the police," she said, her tone sharp. The workers exchanged glances but eventually began packing up their equipment. As they drove off, Laura couldn't shake the feeling that this was another tactic meant to intimidate her and establish control over her land. She immediately called Ellen, who listened carefully as Laura described the incident. "They're testing your boundaries," Ellen said. "Literally and figuratively. It's a psychological game to wear you down, but it's also a legal strategy. If they can show evidence of ongoing disputes over boundaries, it could complicate your case." "What should I do?" Laura asked, her frustration evident. "Document everything, like you've been doing," Ellen replied. "And I'll send a cease and desist letter to the committee regarding unauthorized activity on your property. We need to make it clear that you're not backing down." That evening, Laura took a moment to reflect on everything that had happened over the past few weeks. Her once peaceful home now felt like a battleground, and the constant tension was starting to take its toll. But as much as she hated the situation, she knew she couldn't give up. This was her home, her sanctuary, and she wasn't going to let anyone take it from her. The next day, Laura received an unexpected visitor. A young man in a suit stood on her doorstep, holding a leather briefcase. He introduced himself as an independent mediator hired by the committee to help resolve the conflict amicably. Laura almost laughed at the irony. The same people who had been threatening and harassing her now wanted to play nice? She let him in, though, curious to see what he had to say. The man's demeanor was polite but practiced, every word carefully chosen. He explained that the committee was willing to work with her to find a solution that benefited both parties. He even hinted at financial compensation if she agreed to sell her property. "It's a win-win," he said with a polished smile. "You can avoid the stress of ongoing disputes, and the neighborhood can move forward with its planned improvements." Laura's temper flared. "Let me make something clear," she said, her voice ice-cold. "I'm not interested in your money, and I'm not going anywhere. You can tell Marjorie and her friends that they're wasting their time." The man's smile faltered for a brief moment before he quickly recovered. "I'll relay your message," he said, standing to leave. "But I'd advise you to consider the offer carefully. It's the best you'll get." As he walked out, Laura couldn't help but feel a pang of unease. The calm, calculated approach was a stark contrast to the overt threats and harassment she had been dealing with. It made her wonder just how far they were willing to go to get what they wanted. That night, Laura woke to the sound of glass shattering. Heart pounding, she grabbed her phone and crept toward the source of the noise. One of the windows in her living room had been smashed, and a brick lay on the floor surrounded by shards of glass. Taped to the brick was another note: "This is your last warning. Leave while you can." Shaking with anger and fear, Laura called the police. This time, the responding officers seemed to take the situation more seriously. They photographed the scene and promised to increase patrols in the area, but their assurances did little to calm Laura's nerves. It was clear that whoever was behind this wasn't going to stop until they got what they wanted. The next morning, Marcus called with another update. "I dug a little deeper into Horizon Partners," he said. "They've been working quietly to secure permits for a large-scale commercial development in your area. But here's the catch: the project can't move forward unless they acquire a certain percentage of the surrounding properties. Your land is a critical piece of the puzzle." Laura let out a bitter laugh. "So all of this, the notices, the threats, the vandalism, it's just about money?" Pretty much, Marcus replied. "But there's more. I found evidence that they've been using shell companies to buy up properties at below market prices. They're trying to make it look like voluntary sales, but in reality they're pressuring owners to sell through intimidation." Laura's jaw tightened. "What can we do with this information?" "I've already passed it along to Ellen," Marcus said. "She's going to use it to strengthen your case. But be careful, Laura. These people play dirty, and they're not going to like being exposed." The warning proved prescient. That afternoon, Laura returned home to find a notice posted on her gate, claiming that her property was being investigated for multiple code violations. It listed everything from unapproved landscaping to excessive noise, all blatantly false accusations. It was clear that the committee was doubling down, trying to overwhelm her with bureaucratic nonsense in the hopes that she would cave. But instead of feeling defeated, Laura felt a surge of determination. They wanted her to feel isolated and powerless, but she wasn't alone. She had Ellen, Marcus, and a growing number of neighbors who were beginning to see the committee for what it really was. Together, they were building a case that could not only protect her home but also expose the corruption at the heart of the committee and Horizon Partners. As the sun set that evening, Laura sat on her porch, staring at the horizon. The fight was far from over, and she knew the next steps would be even harder. But for the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope. She wasn't just defending her home, she was standing up to a system that had preyed on too many people for too long, and she wasn't going to stop until justice was served. The days leading up to the court hearing were a whirlwind of activity for Laura. Ellen had managed to secure a temporary restraining order against the committee, halting any further actions against Laura's property, but it hadn't stopped the harassment. The latest escalation came in the form of a letter claiming that the committee would begin foreclosure proceedings if Laura didn't pay the growing fines for her alleged non-compliance. The absurdity of the claim didn't stop it from rattling her, but Ellen assured her it was nothing more than an empty threat designed to intimidate. Meanwhile, Marcus continued to uncover damning evidence. Emails between Marjorie Crane, other committee members, and Horizon partners revealed blatant collusion. The documents made it clear that Marjorie had been using her position to target specific properties for acquisition, funneling them to Horizon at deeply discounted rates under the guise of voluntary sales. It was a coordinated effort, and Laura's property was one of the final pieces they needed to complete their plan. "They're desperate," Marcus said during a call. "Your refusal to sell is holding up their entire project. If they can't secure your property, the whole thing could collapse. That's why they're pushing so hard." Knowing she was a key obstacle to their plans only strengthened Laura's resolve. Ellen had built a strong case, and the court hearing was their chance to expose everything. Still, the days dragged by with an oppressive tension. Laura couldn't shake the feeling that something big was coming. The night before the hearing, her worst fears were realized. Laura was jolted awake at 3 a.m. by the piercing wail of her security alarm. Adrenaline surging, she grabbed her phone and checked the live feed from her cameras. 2 masked figures were on her property, cutting through the fence near her backyard. She dialed 911, but before the police could arrive, the intruders had fled, leaving behind more damage, another smashed camera, and spray-painted graffiti on her hot tub that read "Time's Up." The police took the incident seriously this time, but Laura knew it was meant to rattle her. They wanted her to walk into court feeling vulnerable and overwhelmed. Instead, it had the opposite effect. By morning, she was more determined than ever to face them head-on. The courtroom was packed when Laura arrived. On one side sat Marjorie Crane and a group of committee members, their faces smug and composed. On the other side were Laura, Ellen, and a few supportive neighbors who had come to back her up. The tension was palpable as the judge entered and called the hearing to order. Ellen's opening arguments were concise and devastating. She presented the boundary adjustment document as evidence, pointing out the lack of proper notification to affected homeowners. She then revealed the financial ties between Marjorie and Horizon partners, supported by bank records and emails uncovered by Marcus. These so-called adjustments were not made in the interest of the community, Ellen said, her voice steady but firm. They were orchestrated to enrich a select few individuals at the expense of property owners like my client. This is not a case of rule enforcement, it is a case of exploitation. Marjorie's attorney attempted to argue that the committee was acting within its rights to maintain the neighborhood's standards, but Ellen was relentless. She produced testimony from neighbors like James and Elena, who detailed their experiences of being pressured, fined, and harassed. Each story painted a clear picture of a committee that had overstepped its authority and used intimidation as a weapon. The turning point came when Marcus entered the courtroom with a last-minute piece of evidence, a whistleblower. One of the committee's former members, a nervous man named Peter, had agreed to testify. His voice trembled as he recounted meetings where Marjorie and her allies had openly discussed targeting specific properties and splitting profits with Horizon partners. They didn't care about the rules, Peter admitted under oath. It was all about money. They wanted to flip the neighborhood for development, and anyone who got in the way was a problem to be dealt with. Marjorie's composure cracked for the first time as Peter spoke. She whispered furiously to her attorney, her confidence visibly shaken. When it was Marjorie's turn to testify, Ellen dismantled her arguments piece by piece. "Can you explain why Horizon Partners paid you over $50,000 for consulting services?" Ellen asked, holding up a bank statement. Marjorie stammered, claiming it was a legitimate business arrangement unrelated to her role on the committee. But the damage was done. The evidence was overwhelming, and her carefully constructed facade crumbled under the weight of her lies. The judge's ruling was swift and decisive. The boundary adjustment was declared invalid, and the committee's actions were deemed unlawful. The court ordered an immediate halt to all fines and harassment against Laura, and Marjorie was referred for further investigation into possible criminal misconduct. As the gavel struck, signaling the end of the hearing, Laura felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had won. But more importantly, she had exposed the corruption at the heart of the committee's actions. Outside the courtroom, James and Elena approached her, their faces filled with gratitude. "You didn't just fight for yourself," Elena said. "You fought for all of us. Thank you." Laura smiled, but her victory was bittersweet. The experience had taken a toll on her mentally, emotionally, and physically. As she drove home that evening, she passed by her damaged fence and the graffiti still staining her hot tub. She knew the fight wasn't entirely over. The legal battle might be won, but the scars left behind would take time to heal. Later that night, as she sat in her backyard, staring at the hot tub that had once been her refuge, she resolved to rebuild. Not just the physical damage to her home, but her sense of peace and security. The people who had tried to take everything from her had failed, but their actions had taught her a powerful lesson. She was stronger than she had ever realized. For now, she would rest. But tomorrow, she would start anew, stronger, wiser, and ready for whatever came next. The days following the courtroom victory were a mix of relief and reflection for Laura. The immediate threats had subsided, and the restraining order ensured that Marjorie and her associates couldn't continue their campaign of harassment. But the damage they had inflicted, both physically on her property and emotionally on her peace of mind, lingered. The hot tub, once a symbol of her sanctuary, now felt like a monument to everything she had endured. Laura spent the next week repairing the most visible signs of the conflict. The graffiti on the hot tub was scrubbed clean, the broken fence was replaced, and new cameras were installed to monitor her property more effectively. Neighbors who had watched her struggle from the sidelines began to reach out, offering help with repairs or simply thanking her for standing up to the corruption that had plagued the community. James, her elderly neighbor, stopped by one afternoon with a small gift, a potted plant to replace the ones that had been trampled during the committee's intimidation tactics. "You gave us all courage, Laura," he said, his voice warm with gratitude. "Most of us were too scared to fight, but you showed us that we don't have to let them push us around." Elena, the single mother, joined her for coffee the next morning and shared that she, too, had filed a complaint against the committee. "It's amazing how quickly people change their tune when someone like you leads the way," Elena said with a smile. "We're finally standing up for ourselves." The transformation in the neighborhood was evident. With Marjorie under investigation and her power stripped away, the committee dissolved entirely within weeks. Horizon partners, exposed for their underhanded tactics, abandoned their development plans and withdrew from the area. For the first time in months, Laura felt a sense of genuine relief. But the experience had left her with lingering questions. Why had it taken such an extreme fight to stop something so blatantly wrong? How many others had been forced to leave their homes without the resources or resilience to resist? Laura couldn't shake the feeling that her victory was just one small battle in a much larger war against greed and exploitation. Determined to turn her ordeal into something meaningful, Laura began reaching out to advocacy groups that focused on protecting homeowners' rights. She shared her story publicly, using it as a rallying cry for others who had faced similar injustices. Her story gained traction online, and soon she was connecting with people across the country who had been victimized by corrupt committees, predatory developers, or unfair property laws. Her efforts didn't stop there. Working with Ellen and a coalition of neighbors, Laura helped establish a new community council, not one driven by power or profit, but by a shared commitment to fairness and transparency. The council prioritized protecting individual property rights while fostering a genuine sense of community. One evening, as Laura sat in her backyard, the hot tub bubbling quietly beside her, she finally allowed herself to relax. The fight had been long and grueling, but she had emerged stronger than she ever thought possible. Her home, once a battleground, now felt like a place of peace again. As she sipped her tea, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from a homeowner in another state who had read her story and wanted advice on how to fight back against a similar situation. Laura smiled, typing out a reply. She hadn't set out to become an advocate, but if her experience could help others, then it had all been worth it. The scars left by the conflict would always be there, but they were a reminder of what she had overcome. Her home, her sanctuary, was hers again, not just because she had fought for it, but because she had refused to let fear dictate her life. Laura's story wasn't just about winning a fight, it was about reclaiming her power and inspiring others to do the same.